Get my clock out. I guess that clock is dead. Book of Ruth, chapter number 2. And we will read starting in verse 17. Verse 16, and Boaz told his servants, and let some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean them, and rebuke her not. So she, being Ruth, she gleaned in the field until even, and beat out that she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she brought forth, and gave to her that she had reserved after she was sufficed. And her mother-in-law said unto her, Where hast thou gleaned today? And where wroughtest thou? Blessed is he that did take knowledge of thee. And she showed her mother-in-law with whom she had wrought, and said, The man's name with whom I wrought today is Boaz. And Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living unto the dead. And Naomi said unto her, The man is near kin unto us, and one of our next kinsmen. And Ruth the Moabitess said, He said unto me also, Thou shalt keep fast by my young men, until they have ended all my harvest. And Naomi said unto Ruth, her daughter-in-law, It is good, my daughter, that thou go out with his maidens, that they meet thee not in any other field. So she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of the barley harvest, of the wheat harvest, and dwelt with her mother-in-law. And we'll stop our reading there. Tonight I want to look at the virtue and the purity of Ruth. The virtue and the purity of Ruth. Whenever we come to individuals in the Bible, I think there are a few ways that we can look at the individuals. We can look at them in the historical perspective and say that these are real people doing real things in real times. They had real pains and struggles, and we can look at it from that perspective. We can look at it from a picture of Jesus Christ in the church. We can look at the types and the pictures and the spiritual side of what the book has to say. So we have that aspect we can look at. But also another aspect we can look at is just the examples of these people. Because these Old Testament saints and the New Testament as well, God has given them for our examples. That we can look whether positive or negative. And we're not to moralize the whole thing and just make the Bible nothing but a principles of do this and don't do that, but they are our examples. So we can look at godly men and godly women and see their godliness and their purity and what they did right and what they did wrong, and we can learn from them. And we can see how God had worked in their lives as an encouragement to us or as a warning to us. And so before we get to the pictures of Christ in the book, I want to look at the virtue and the purity of Ruth tonight. We'll see a little bit of Naomi, Lord willing, next time, but I want to look at Ruth tonight and see how God shows us an example of a woman who has been born again and what it looks like when God works marvelously in the life of an individual. I like the book of Ruth because Ruth and Boaz both, they're just such godly pictures. They're such godly people. And we know they're sinners, and we know that they were not perfect. But what God chose to reveal to us about Ruth, she's just a sweet picture of what we see in Ruth and the kind of woman that she was, and Boaz as well. But the story just permeates of love and godliness and faithfulness and virtue and purity. So we can see a lot in that. And even Naomi here, you start the book off, Naomi says, Call me bitter. And she wasn't really, she was understandably upset and things just weren't going right for her. But Naomi changes. And I wonder if Ruth had that effect on Naomi, if her godliness and her dedication and her devotion did not kind of lead her back onto the path. Because when we read here, you can almost, maybe it's just me and my, maybe it's just me, and maybe I'm just imagining this, but in verse number 20, it seems to me that something happens to Naomi. Whenever Ruth comes back and sees all that barley, and she said, "Where'd you get this?" And so, a man gave it to me. His name was Boaz. In verse 20, and Naomi said unto her, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left all his kindness to the living and to the dead." And it just seems at this point right there that something happened, that there was a change. She rounded the corner, or she got over the hill, or whatever metaphor we want to use to say that. She got over the hump, that she just kind of changed here. And there's a sweetness about those words, and there's a change in Naomi's spirit from here on out. So we find that God is working in her, and God is blessing her. And God didn't leave Naomi down, but He lifted her back up as well through His providence and Ruth's influence and Boaz's blessing. Well, we want to look at Ruth tonight and see her purity. The first thing that I noticed here is her work. We see the purity and the virtue of her work. In verse 17 and 18, it says she gleaned until even, beat out that she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley, and she took it up and went to the city. And she brought forth after what she had in reserve there. So the Bible tells us she went out to work. Now remember that Boaz told the men to leave those handfuls of purpose to drop some stuff every once in a while, so Ruth could go by and pick it up. That they were to leave it up behind, so she would come, and there was a whole lot there for her to grab. And Boaz was blessing her. But she worked. She didn't stop. It said that she gleaned what she could until it was evening. She didn't say, "Wow, look at this handfuls of purpose. I got enough to eat the rest of the week. I'm going home." No, she kept working. She had come to get what she could when she could do it. She was being blessed in her work, and she continued on in her work. That's a very good picture of what kind of a woman Ruth was. That she started working and she kept working. She started working and she kept at it as long as she could and as hard as she could. She kept on working. In Proverbs chapter 31, in the Proverbs 31 portion of the book where it talks about this virtuous woman. Proverbs 31, verse 27, "She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness." And this whole section of this virtuous woman talks about what she does for her family and how hard that she works. And she's up before everybody else is awake to get things going. And she's working, she's buying, she's selling, she's working with her hands, she's taking care of her household. This is how we can see that Ruth was a virtuous woman in this aspect, that she was a worker. She worked hard. Now, we live in a society where if you don't get a paycheck, and people say, "Well, you don't work because you don't get a paycheck from somebody else." Well, that's not what the Bible says about work. Work is labor, and you don't qualify, or you don't define work by whether or not somebody pays you. Somebody else pays you. The Bible says that you say, prove that. You say somebody doesn't work unless they have a job working for somebody else. Well, who did Adam receive a paycheck from? Adam worked and labored in the garden. Who paid Adam? Or it says that the Lord rested from all His work. So who paid God? So you're going to say God didn't work in the work of creation? Of course He did. So work is defined as going out and achieving, doing what is required of it. So here Ruth she was going out. She wasn't getting paid. She wasn't someone's servant. She wasn't someone's employee, but she labored. She worked. So whether you work for somebody else, or whether you work for a church, whether you work for the Lord, whether you work in the home, work is not defined by getting a paycheck from somebody else. So Ruth was a worker. She was diligent. She put her hand to her work and worked while she could. In Proverbs chapter number 6, if you're still in Proverbs, Proverbs has a lot to say about labor. In Proverbs chapter 6 and verse number 6. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in summer and gathereth her food in the harvest. How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard, when wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall thy poverty come as one that travaileth, and thy want as an armed man. Harvest doesn't last all year long. You've only got a certain amount of time to do it. And Ruth only had a certain amount of time to glean, so she could get something to eat, and then harvest was over. She only had a certain amount of time, and if she's gleaning, that doesn't mean that she has her pick of whatever she wants, and she can go to the best parts of the field to get it. She had to go to the corners and what was left over. So her opportunity to get some food and get some provision wasn't very long. She had to go and she had to get out like the ant. She didn't have a ruler over her. Ruth didn't. She didn't have anybody saying, now get back to work. This was all on her. She was going to eat, or she was going to work, or her and Naomi was going to go hungry. So she had no master over her, but it was just her ethic, her work ethic, and it was her godly work ethic that put her to the field and started working. So in this we can see that Ruth was a godly woman because she was, you can see her virtue and her purity in this. She finished her work, and she worked as she was commanded to do. In Proverbs 10, verse number 5, it says, He that gathereth in summer is a wise son, but he that sleepeth in harvest is a son that causeth shame. So we can learn a lesson from Ruth that we need to work while we have the opportunity. We have to work when it's time to work. The boys here, you guys, you say, well, we're doing school, I'm not to work. This is your harvest of education. This is your time where you can learn. This is your time in your whole life where you have to get your education. And so this is your time of harvest for education. Or whatever it is. This is whatever you put your hands to the plow to do. We need to use that to all of our mind and not sleep in the time of harvest that God has given us. Ruth didn't stop because she was tired. She didn't stop because it was dark. It said she worked until evening, and then after that, she worked till evening, and then she came and beat out what she had. So she didn't say, well, I've got enough for today, and there's a couple hours of daylight left, so I'm going home before it gets dark, and that way I can get this done and get to bed at a decent hour. She worked until it was dark, and then when it was dark and she couldn't work outside anymore, then she went and did the stuff that she could do inside. So she didn't stop because she was tired. She didn't stop because it was dark. She could have planned to quit and be home before dark, but she kept working while it was time to work. There was only a certain amount of time. So as I'm saying this, maybe you were thinking about the spiritual aspect. Maybe you're thinking about what Jesus said in John chapter number 4. On the spiritual side of this, John 4:34. Jesus saith unto them, My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish the work. Say not ye, there are yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest. Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest. And he that reapeth receiveth wages, and gathereth fruit unto life eternal, that both he that soweth and he that reapeth may rejoice together. And herein is the saying true, one soweth and another reapeth. I sent you to reap that whereupon you bestowed no labor, and other men labor, and you entered into their labors. So we have a short time to live for God. You think of Ruth, that she came there as it was harvest. So harvest was already going on when she got back home. And now she's got this short period of time to gather food for her and her mother-in-law. And she gets there early and she stays until after dark. And she works and she works and she works because the time is coming where no man can work. So she does everything that she can, all that she's able to do. You can't blame Ruth for not picking as much as somebody else or gathering as much as somebody else, but she did everything that she could do, all of her strength that she was able to do. And we can see this, that we only have a short time to serve God. We only have a small time to grow in holiness and to gather and to reap and to sow. We can't say, well, I'm going to do this now, and then later on in life I'm going to serve the Lord. Or later on, somewhere down the road, I'm going to do something for God. If we're going to serve God, we need to do it now. Today is the day not only of salvation, but of service. If there's something that we're going to do for the Lord, we better get busy. And we better get busy and do what we can. Now is the time to serve Him, not to put it off to later. Later is not the time to serve or to witness, or if you got somebody on your heart that you're praying for, but the Lord would save them. Don't say, well, I got to put this off a couple months, or I just can't find the right time to go witness to them. No, go now while there's light today. And we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know the time of somebody's death. We don't know if that friend or that neighbor or whoever we might be praying for, we don't know that we may never speak to them again. So now is the time. Look spiritually to Ruth, not only just in this life and working, but spiritually. Look to her and follow that example, that work for the Lord while we're able, while we have strength, or while we have life, or while we have opportunity. We don't want to look to the future as an excuse to the present, but follow Christ today and the work of the Lord in our lives. We find also not only her work, we see her virtue and purity, but we see her companions. We find that. He that walketh with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed. Well, who were Ruth's companions? Her companions were not the young ladies there in the town. She could have said to Naomi, your God's going to be my God, your people's going to be my people. And then she could have got there and she could have saw a bunch of young ladies running around about her age and say, you know what, I don't want to hang out with my mother-in-law the rest of my life. These girls are out running the town, or these girls are out having a good time. I'm young. I'm not married. And here I am. I misspoke when I said I'm going to stay here with my mother-in-law. She could have maybe went off and lived it up with some young ladies in the neighborhood. That's what Dinah did. She made that mistake in the book of Genesis. And she made that mistake of running around and messing around with people that she shouldn't have been messing around with. And it cost a lot of people their lives. But Ruth stuck to what she said she was going to do. She didn't go off to find some girls her own age, or she didn't go off to have some fun while she was young, but she did what was right, and she did what she was supposed to have done. She honored her mother-in-law. She provided for her mother-in-law, and she cared for her, and she loved her, and she kept her promise. Ruth swore her allegiance to Naomi, and she swore that she would serve her and her God. And when they got to Bethlehem, she didn't change her mind, and she didn't abandon her when times got tough. And later on, when Ruth sought marriage, Boaz reveals why he wants her to marry her to start with and redeem her. And we're jumping ahead a little bit, but we do see the godly character of Ruth in that. In chapter 3 of Ruth, verse number 11. Listen to what it says here. It said, "Now, my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requirest, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman." So, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but Boaz, whenever they come back to talk to one another, her and Ruth and Boaz, Boaz says, everybody knows about you. See, Ruth desired to be married to Boaz, and she requested that he redeem her. And she didn't go running after the younger men or look for somebody else, but she went after Boaz. She loved Boaz, and Ruth in her heart was following God. Remember, she came into this country not expecting anything. Naomi kept telling her, you're going to die alone, you're going to die poor, there's nothing for you in Judah. There's nothing for you in my home country. You need to go back so you can find rest or find a husband. You go back home because there's nothing for you in Judah. And Ruth wouldn't have any of it. She said, I'm going to follow you no matter what. I don't care if I die alone. I don't care if I die starving to death following you. I'm following you, your people, and your God. Well, now she gets here, and it wasn't like Naomi said. It wasn't, she's not going to die in starvation. And here's Boaz, and she may have an opportunity with Boaz. So Ruth went on and lived by faith, and God is blessing her here. But up until this point, Ruth didn't know that any of this was going to happen. That's part of the remarkable story of the book, that Ruth didn't expect any of this to happen. This was not like it's something that was going to be common for her. She fully expected that she was going to live a life of poverty and hardship and sorrow. And she went by faith, and she was going to do that. She lived in quiet contentment. Ruth submitted herself to God before they came back home. Ruth submitted herself. She submitted herself to Naomi. She submitted herself to God and whatever God had in store for her. And Ruth was living in quiet contentment. She submitted herself and drew her joy for living for God. And we need to ask if we can live like Ruth. And we know the end of the story and how God blessed, but what if the end of the story wasn't like it was, played out? What if Ruth got there and did live in poverty and did live in hardship and sorrow? Well, she was fully prepared to do that. And her godliness and her virtue was shown that she was well known in the town for living a virtuous, godly, contented life. She woke up, she would work, and then she came back. Can we say that we can live in quiet contentment such as Ruth? If that's what we do, if we wake up and work and then come home and go to sleep and do it all over again. To live with little, to not have any plans or foreseeable hope other than Christ. Can we be content in that situation? The Bible says godliness and contentment is great gain. And Ruth was content with what God had providentially brought into her life. She lived in this pain and this sorrow. And we remember Ruth, or remember Naomi, lost her sons and her husband. But we got to remember too that Ruth lost her husband. But Ruth also lost her husband. And what a picture of godly contentment is in Ruth. And I'll tell you right now, I wish that I had the spirit that Ruth has in suffering and trials, because she just had such a quiet and meekness about her. And her contentment in God's providence is such a glorious picture of God's sustaining and sufficient grace in the life of the believer. Grace is sufficient for us, Jesus said. Well, Christ is enough. Can we live with the idea that maybe it won't get any better? That's not the American dream. The American dream is, everything's going to get better and everything will be better for the next generation than it is for this generation. Well, can we live in contentment to know that it probably won't be better for the next generation than it was for this generation? Can we live in contentment and knowing that there may be troublesome and trials and tribulations to come? Can we see trials more precious than gold in our life? That's where our theology, that's where the rubber hits the road in our theology. When we can take what we know and apply it. It's easy for us as believers in sovereign grace to tell somebody else in the trial that God works all things for good. But when it hurts, when it's hard, is whenever we have to tell ourselves that. And when we have to remind ourselves that godliness with contentment is great gain. And when we have to face trials and sufferings with this. Lots of times whenever tragedy happens, It's too late to go back and start reading your theology books and preparing for that. But we need to learn to suffer well and to learn the lessons now and learn what God has to say now before we get to these situations. But Jesus said His grace is sufficient, and Ruth lived with that idea that in quiet contentment that she was just going to live and have what God would have for her. Well, she lived in contentment. She was humble. She went home to Naomi, and she didn't go and brag about her day's work. Now think about the situation. Naomi sends Ruth out, and she comes back with not only her belly full, but a whole bunch left over. And she walks in the door, and Naomi just was amazed. Where in the world did you get all this? She was amazed. And Ruth could have easily said, "Well, I'm just a hard worker. You Jewish people just don't know how to work like us Moabite girls." And she could have took credit. She could have bragged about how hard she worked, but she immediately said, "Oh no, it wasn't me. It wasn't me that did it. It was Boaz, and Boaz had blessed me, and all this." Well, the Bible tells us that she gleaned all day long, and after it got dark, she just kept on working. So she did work hard. She did labor hard. And yes, Boaz did bless her, but she didn't go and brag on herself, did she? She gave all the honor to another. And she didn't take any praise and glory for herself. So she was a humble girl. She was a humble woman. And she was known throughout the land for her purity and her virtue. It said there in chapter 3, verse 11 again, "For all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman." This was known throughout all the people what kind of woman she was. This is what it means to be salt and light. This is what it means to have a godly influence on people. She didn't live for her testimony. And we're not supposed to live for our testimony, but we're supposed to live for Christ and have a testimony. And that's what Ruth did. Ruth didn't think in her mind, I'm going to go and I'm going to work real hard. That way people will see that I'm a Christian and they'll accept me, and then that way I'll have a good testimony. Ruth lived for God. And she lived to do what God was pleasing to God. And because she did that, she had a testimony and people glorified her Father in heaven. But she wasn't trying to be a Christian. She was one. She wasn't putting on the airs of godliness. She was godly. She didn't work to be seen, but she was seen when she worked. And that was what Jesus tells us, that when we're salt and light, that when we serve Him, other people will see us and glorify our Father. But we don't live to put out something so people can see. We live for Christ and people will know us. So we live for Christ, and that will give us our testimony. We don't live to have a good testimony. We live to glorify God. So sometimes you can put your testimony up in the front and not put Christ up in the front and live for your testimony. And the problem with that is, whenever something happens and people start to frown at you a little bit, you say, "Well, I don't want people to be mad at me, so I'm not going to do that because it'll ruin my testimony." We have to be willing for people to laugh and mock us and call us names or whatever the case may be. We have to be willing to become a fool for Christ's sake, and drag our name through the mud for Christ's sake, if you understand what I mean. We have to stand for the truth, and sometimes that'll cause us to not have the favor of those out and about. Well, the result of all this is the whole town saw that she was a godly woman, and she was glorified in it. And that was not her intention at all. Her intention was to do what was right, and to follow God, and to love her mother-in-law. But by doing that, God used her. So, tomorrow, and the next day, you live for the glory of God. And you live doing what God has placed you to do. And whatever it is, whether it is cooking supper, whether it is whatever the job is, whatever it is, whether it's doing your schoolwork, or whether it's me putting something in the box and shipping it somewhere, we do it for the glory of God. And we do it for the glory of God, and that we are working for God's glory. We are doing this labor that God has placed us in for God's glory. And if we do it for that, then we can be salt and light, and then we can use those opportunities God's placed us in to glorify His name. And that's all she was doing. She's just working as a godly woman, and she glorified God, and she was a testimony to God's saving grace. Because people said, man, look at that Moabite woman. She acts like us. She doesn't act like a Moabite. She acts like us. She's different from all those other foreigners. God's done something to that woman. She acts like a Jew. Well, she acted like that because she acted like a godly woman because God was indwelling in her. God had changed her. She saved her. For all the city of my people doth know that thou art, fill in the blank. How would they fill in the blank if they were talking about you? For all my people doth know that you are what kind of a person? Well, hopefully people would know that we are a godly people. Ruth was a joy and an encouragement to the whole city, and she didn't even know it. She didn't even know how she was affecting people. Just by her quiet, humble, godly spirit. She didn't even know what she was doing. And you don't know how you help people or how you encourage people by, just being here. You encourage people. Just by coming in the house of God, you encourage people. And you don't know that whenever your neighbors wake up on Sunday morning, they look out your window and they see you driving past every Sunday, or they see you coming over every Sunday, you don't know what kind of impact that you're having. So just live for God and trust that He will use your life for His glory. Ruth didn't live to be seen by anybody but God blessed that. And for God's people, for His church, we must walk with Christ and humbly serve Him and be content in Christ and be known for what Christ has done for us. Well, may God bless us as we think about Ruth, and may God help us to glorify His name such as she did.